This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former House Speaker Joe Mavretic, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and former legislator, retired, educated David Diamont from Surry County. Well, this week our panel is going to talk about the recent announcements by the NCAA and ACC canceling championship sporting events in our state because of HB 2, the marathon session by the State Board of Elections regarding early voting, and we'll share some good news and bad news on high school graduations and school grades. Let's get started. Sports fans in our state got a 1-2 punch this past week. On Monday, the NCAA announced it was pulling 7 tournament competitions because of HB 2. On Wednesday, the ACC followed suit by moving 10 conference championships out of the state. Republicans, including Governor Pat McCrory, Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest, and legislators doubled down in supporting the bill. The state GOP said the NCAA decision was so absurd it's almost comical, and it was politically motivated. Democrats said the action demonstrated the discriminatory practices of state leaders and called for a repeal of the bill. John, do you really think our legislators had any idea how much backlash was going to be caused for this legislation? And furthermore, why didn't they listen to voices of reason who were trying to help them minimize the impact of it?
Some legislators absolutely knew, others probably miscalculated or knew but didn't mind it or didn't think it was that big of a negative. This was predictable, the NCAA and ACC decisions. It was predicted. It was actually fairly widely discussed this summer during the legislative session that these kinds of announcements were likely in the fall, in September and October. The lawmakers who think that the bill was fine as they did it believe that they're standing on principle, that the NCAA is hypocritical, that the distinctions they're making between North Carolina and other states are not very large. I think there's some truth to that, but the fundamental problem here is that the optics and the general gist of the bill, the way the bill was enacted, the way it's been discussed over the course of time, strikes a lot of North Carolinians who have legitimate concerns about privacy in showers, privacy in locker rooms, but it strikes them that the bill itself was flawed or that there were other ways to address the problem that would not have provoked this backlash.
David, just how significant are these losses of these games? I mean, we've heard estimates that $30 million worth of revenue will be lost. Is that the major impact, the major loss that was suffered from the loss of them?
Well, if you're a North Carolinian, you've been to the ACC tournament like I have for years and years and years. This is personal. We pride ourselves in bringing in these sporting events, and I know it makes a lot of money, but we just pride ourselves in having very strong communities that support college athletics. And the HB 2 thing, I don't think most legislators realized that it was going to have this kind of impact. And because some districts are so one-sided, some folks will not have to answer to it in an election.
Joe, how do you respond to the charges that these actions were just political hardball by the NCAA and the ACC? They're just playing political hardball to try to get the state to change the policy.
Well, yeah, I think clearly that's a part of it, but I think what most people have forgotten is that early on this show we talked about Republican majorities, and we said one of the things they have to watch out for is violating Hartman's law, that you should never create more enemies than you can handle at the time. And I'm not so sure that my Latin is good, but festina lenti comes to my mind, which means make haste slowly. And if you want it real bad, that's how it's going to turn out, and that's the story of HB 2.
Chris, Governor McCrory and state Republicans just seem to be doubling down on this situation. I mean, McCrory went so far as to say, hey, let's not rush to judgment here. Let the courts be the final arbiter. But in the meantime, we keep losing events. How do you judge their response?
Well, and he also blasted the NCAA. I always find it as a weird economic development strategy when a company doesn't come or disagrees with something, and then we blast the company as if that's going to help in the long term get them back here. I think there's a lot of things that were interesting about the response, but I think what a lot of people are missing is this is not just about bathrooms. It's about the optics. It's about the perception. They prohibit local governments from protecting LGBT people against discrimination. The NCAA cited that in its decision to move those championship events. This is about the perception that North Carolina is okay with discrimination. And we can argue the merits of each individual part of the bill, but that's what it's all about. North Carolina is perceived as being out of step with the rest of the country.
I want to ask David and Joe both, because both of you served a long time in the legislature. Democrat and some Republican legislators are calling for a repeal to this bill, but there doesn't seem to be any interest in calling a special session. What do you think the chances are it'll be repealed in 2017?
I think there's a good chance that there will be significant amendments, but this is one now that is kind of like a dagger in your back. If you were for it before, then you got to be for it now.
Interesting. David?
I think that the districts are so one-sided, there's no reason to change. If your district is in favor of HB2, why change? There's no political retaliation. Yeah. There's no pressure.
But there are rank and file Republicans, Democrats, obviously, most of them, not all, want to repeal it. But rank and file Republicans, Senator Tamara Behringer of Wake County, who's in a very close re-election race, who's down significantly, has said she wants to repeal it, which was a big deal. And there are rumors in Raleigh now that rank and file Republicans are talking to the legislative leaders about doing something before the election.
Well,
but that's the districts that are competitive.
Right. That's
right. A lot of districts are not competitive at all.
That's right.
So there's no reason for them to. Are there any other cancellations that might? Some have suggested perhaps we might lose some NASCAR events. We might see some.
The PGA golf tournament in Charlotte, which originally said that they would keep it there in 2017. There are rumors now in Raleigh that decision is being reconsidered. They may not move it, but that is certainly floating around in the halls of the legislature.
The key question here, John, is with fewer than 60 days remaining in the election, how are these announcements going to affect the outcome of some of our elections, especially the governor's race, lieutenant governors, and maybe down by the Council of State?
I think the governor's race is affected to some extent because of the sports angle here, sort of elevating the issue even further than it already was. Primarily, the way this has affected the governor's race is squeezing out all other news. I mean, the same day that some of this came out, the economic reports came out. Probably the best news North Carolina has gotten in McCrory's entire tenure. Median household income went up in North Carolina over the last 3 years faster than any other state. And that's not going to be front page news. That's not going to lead the newscasts because it has squeezed everything else out. The actual merits, as Chris was getting at, some of the provisions of HB2 are unpopular. Some are actually still popular, or at least most of the people think the intention was reasonable. But that's not what the political consequences are based on.
Yeah, and so far as it goes, any final thoughts about HB2, any further actions, any further reactions that we're expecting?
There was a missed opportunity during the legislative session in the summer to make some substantial changes that would have addressed many concerns about the bill without subjecting privacy rights in showers and locker rooms to dispute. They didn't take that action now. I suspect something like that will happen in 2017.
I've been mystified all along that, number one, the thing is, all of this is based upon federal law that requires male and female identification of bathrooms, and also nobody has raised the issue about why didn't Charlotte and Mecklenburg ask for a local bill to begin with?
Yeah.
Well, but again, this bill they didn't just do bathrooms. They repealed local ordinances, and I think that I disagree with the bathroom provision, and we can argue about that. But I think they went so far beyond bathrooms. They created a perception. They did a million things that even the governor didn't want them to do. I think he shouldn't have signed it so fast and should have had some kind of dialogue before he did.
Don't forget you can get our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle, just by visiting our website, ncspin.com, and signing up. We don't use your information in any way, by the way. You can get lots more perspective pieces in my weekly column, get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NCSpin on Facebook, Spin Cycle, or on Twitter at NCSpin Tweets. After these messages, we're going to talk about the State Board of Elections rulings.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
After a 12-hour marathon session, the State Board of Elections sorted through various counties' attempts to comply with the court order to restore 17-day early voting periods. In 67 counties, the three-member county boards of election came to unanimous consensus, but 33 boards could still not. At issue was how many sites in a county to have open and whether to allow Sunday voting. Joe Mavretic, despite the court ruling, this has turned into an extremely partisan confrontation. Democrats want Sunday voting and more early sites, with Republicans wanting fewer sites and no Sunday voting. Based on the determinations of the State Board of Elections, who won and who lost this?
Oh, I think the Democrats won clearly, but there are some numbers that the viewers ought to keep in mind about voting issues. Of the people 18 or over in North Carolina, 18% of them don't even register. Of those that register, only about 30% don't vote. 30 and 18 is 48%. So 48% on average of North Carolinians eligible to vote either don't register to vote or just don't vote. So we're making a whole lot of noise about voting with a population that almost 50-50 don't care much about it at all.
Interesting. David, the decisions on whether to open these multiple voting sites and Sunday voting were left to the county boards of elections. Having served in the legislature and probably gone through a lot of these election law revisions during your tenure, should this be a statewide policy or should the county boards be allowed to have this authority?
I'm firmly believe in local control. All these different issues they're different depending upon the location, what's on the college campus or what's in the middle of a minority community, and different boards approach it different ways. When you look at what came out in the lawsuit, it is blatant what took place. I had no idea. In my area, it sounds like reasonableness. Voter ID. Show me an ID. Anybody that needs has an ID to register to vote. That makes a lot of sense. But when you look what and why they did what they did and the emails went back and forth, it's just like the Democrats used to do back in the Reconstruction. Black codes, literacy tests, poll tax. It's keeping certain people from voting.
Chris, what is the justification for the Democrats wanting more sites in Sunday voting?
Well, they want to make it easier for people to vote. There are a lot of people that have a lot of people that work hourly jobs, people that travel all over the place on their job. I mean, there's a million reasons why people want to make it easier for people to vote, to try to get some of these people who don't vote. We used to have a consensus that the more people that participated in democracy, the better. At election time, sometimes that consensus sort of goes away. I was really struck, for example, and we talked about it on the show a couple weeks ago, Lenoir County came up with a plan to have one early voting site for all 17 days at the Board of Elections downtown in Kinston. I think there's 600 square miles in Lenoir County. It's ridiculous. And thank goodness the State Board of Elections, which, by the way, is appointed by the Republican governor. This wasn't a Democratic board that did this, that I think in most cases, I didn't agree with all their decisions. In most cases, I think made a reasonable determination to balance everybody's interest and make it okay for people to vote.
All right, John, on the other side, why are Republicans so insistent on fewer sites and no Sunday voting?
Well, they're not. In many counties, with all the counties have Republican majority boards of elections. Most of the counties brought to the state, already approved, increases in early voting. Okay, most Republicans did not decrease; they increased early voting. So there was a smaller number of counties that had some reductions.
In the number of sites
and hours. Yeah. A small number of cases when when counties that had Sunday voting that was removed. There were a number of counties where unanimously, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat in a rural county proposed a plan that didn't have Sunday voting because they didn't think there would be that many people to vote on Sunday in that particular jurisdiction. That's why I think local control is fine with state oversight, which is what we have.
Joe, some people favored restricted early voting because they said it reduced the chance of fraud. Have we ever seen any real hard proof of election fraud
No.
in any significant number?
No, but you got to remember that you take a partisan position and then you have to have some camouflage and smoke to conceal the real intent. A lot of the election laws that we have in North Carolina, created by Democrats, were directed toward the African American community, and the Republicans are opposed to that because the African American community votes pretty much as a block for
like
Democrats.
91%.
Yeah, so we ought not to discount the race issue here.
Chris, you think...
Didn't it say that over a period of 6 or 7 years, 40 million people voted, and only 2 times did the local attorneys, district attorneys, bring cases of fraud before the state board?
Yeah,
what was the problem?
Yeah.
But that doesn't make
it was a solution in search of a problem.
The argument, by the way, on early voting, and I'll restate this again, so puts fraud aside because I don't think early voting has much to do with fraud. There is an argument for a shorter, more intense early voting period rather than a longer, more strung out, when you probably get higher voter turnout with 7 or 10 days of early voting rather than 17 or 20 days of early voting, because yes, you have more opportunities to vote, but you reduce the salience of the election day, and there are actual empirical studies that suggest there's a washout effect. If you had a shorter period of intense early voting, that is best.
All right, given what has happened here, Chris, is there a possibility that we might see more lawsuits resulting from the actions of these boards of elections?
There's always a possibility we might see more lawsuits, although, and I think some people were disappointed in a few specific instances, but again, as I mentioned, I think for the most part, the State Board of Elections made the right call in most of these counties. There might be a few lawsuits, but I'd be surprised.
Well, we want to remind everybody, regardless of how many sites and what day your county polls will be open, the early voting begins October 20th. After these messages, we got good news and bad news on education.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Helping people. It's all in a day's work for Wayne Goodwin. As Commissioner of Insurance, Wayne Goodwin's been a tireless advocate for North Carolina families, helping more than 100,000 seniors enroll in the Medicare drug plan while protecting them from insurance scams. And Wayne Goodwin has been fighting big insurance companies' proposals to raise rates for car, home, and health insurance. Wayne Goodwin, more than a public servant, a true friend for consumers.
Healthy individuals improve the economic health of communities. Growing Better Together explores this intersection of rural health and economic development. Join the conversation and meet candidates for governor and U.S. Senate September 26-27 at the 2016 North Carolina Rural Assembly. Register now at ncruralcenter.org.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
North Carolina recently released public school performance data showing high school graduation rates and grades for individual schools. The news was both good and bad. Our high school graduation rate improved to slightly to 85.8%, far better than it was in 2005 when it was 68%. 3/4 of the schools earned a rating of A, B, and C, while schools earning D's and F's declined 20% to fewer than one in 4 schools. David Diamond, The bad news is that 93% of the schools that received D's or F's were made up of 50% or more students from low-income families. Having been an educator for 30 years, what's your solution to improving grades of low-income students?
Well, if I had that solution, I probably wouldn't be sitting at this table. I'd probably be making a six figure somewhere. First of all, what this shows you is where poor kids live. That's what this shows you. And I'd do four things as a starter. First of all, I would reduce class size. Second thing I would do would be to spread the pre-K program into these areas. Third thing I would do would be extend the day and the school year. And lastly, I would recruit quality folks to go there. For instance, I just retired from teaching, but if the state tells me that they will pay off my student loans for my kid went to state and the one that went to Appalachian, I'd be there Monday morning teaching. Those are, if you are a young teacher, go out, they did away with teaching fellows. Yeah, go out and find teachers or students from this area, pay their college tuition if they'll go back and teach in those areas.
Yeah, Joe, Superintendent of Public Instruction, June Atkinson, said she was so happy about the improved graduation rate, she could do a backflip if she could. Comment on these raising graduation rates. You were in the Assembly back in the time when we had 68%. Now it's almost 86%. Comment on it.
Well, first of all, I don't believe that number. And second, if you get to that number, the only way you get to that number is to fiddle with the elements that go into determining what that percentage is. I'd buy somewhere around 78 to 80% graduation rate, but I want to tell you what that means. An 80% graduation rate means that on every school day in North Carolina, 3 bus loads of 40 kids goes off a cliff for the rest of their life. Financially, socially, from a crime point of view, 3 bus loads of kids every day because they drop out from high school. Their life is predetermined for them. Don't be proud of 86%.
John, in grades 3 to 8, reading and math proficiency increased slightly, but both are still below 60%. What does that say to you?
It says that there have been slight increases in proficiency. So if my math is correct, I don't know that I would pass the 4th grade math test. We'll see. There has been some increases in the scores on average. The graduation rate increases are real. There's some that is a real trend because it's a lengthy trend, and the graduation rate was correctly defined. It used to be a lie, and now it's accurate. But here's the reason why it needs to be tempered. Remediation rates at community colleges are still distressingly high. We are graduating kids from high school who don't
60%.
Really have high school skills. That's
Chris, there was some discussion a year ago when these school grades came out that we should change the formula for how we went about evaluating schools and give more credit to improvement rather than just test scores. Has that been done?
No, the House put in its budget, which I thought was a good first step, to do 50% test score, 50% growth in test scores to figure out the formula. The current law is 80% all on one test score, 20% growth. So some of these D and F schools could improve significantly and still get a D or an F, which is the worst thing you can do. You have teachers and kids working their butts off, and you still tell them, oh, you're failing, even though you're improving dramatically. We have to change that formula.
All right, after these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
One of the best parts of our show, you tell us, is when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. So, David Diamont, I'm going to start with you. Tell us something we don't know.
I'm going to take a clue from Rufus Evanson last week's show.
Uh-oh.
He recommended a book to read. Okay, since I retired, I've done a lot more reading. In April of this year, Makers and Takers, a book came out. Time journalist, economist, her name is Runa Harbar, something like that, but talks about the finance industry. 4% of the employment of the nation's in finance, 26% of the profit. Most of our problems deal with economics, and we don't understand our own capitalist system. That was a great book to read, and I encourage folks that watch the show to read the book.
I've got it down, and I'm going to order it. John? Tell us something we don't know.
Speaking of economics, I want to expand a little bit on a point I made earlier in the show about household income. When North Carolina's economy started to perform better in 2013, 2014, 2015 into this year, the response from critics of Pat McCrory, the Republican legislature, was, well, yeah, those are interesting numbers, but what really matters is median household income. That's how people really live. That's the median. It's not thrown off by rich people. Well, the median household income numbers came out. The national average went up 7% over the 3 years. North Carolina went up 21%. These are in inflation-adjusted dollars. The highest increase in the nation. What are they going to say now?
I don't know, but we're going to talk about it on next week's show, so be sure to tune in. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
I had said earlier on the show, I think one of the sleeper issues in this gubernatorial race this year is the coal ash issue. This past week in the Yadkin River near Salisbury, arsenic was found on the surface water near the unlined coal ash pond with 4 times the rate of arsenic that is allowable or acceptable or legal. I think you're going to continue to hear a lot more about coal ash. These unlined landfills are a mess, and that people believe the administration hasn't done enough to clean them up.
Joe, tell us something we don't know.
I watched the Olympics and for hours and hours and hours, and I was very careful to listen to the word diversity. I never heard diversity. I listened carefully for gender neutrality. I never heard gender neutrality. And so I think after a great Olympics, we ought to pay attention to not messing around with gender neutrality and all of these
raising the issue,
diversity issues. If you're good at what you do, it's going to come through.
Interesting. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, sign up for Spin Cycle, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.